Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So Kate, thanks for joining Work School. This is our first of one of many series we're open for. Thank you so much for joining us. We're pretty excited. I've had the opportunity of working alongside some of the things that you're doing at Mass Central, and we're so excited. And I wanted to use this opportunity to talk to you about um, basically the future of higher ed and how we see technology playing a role.
Great.
But before we
Thank you.
begin, give us a brief background and how you got started and what led you to Mass Central. And
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. So I started my career in the private sector. I was trained as a management consultant, asset management, though I did actually specialize in education. So education has been an area of passion for me professionally and personally over the course of my career. And spent time looking actually at data systems within New York State and how New York State could think about having an integrated data capture system to track students throughout in order to improve learnings and outcomes. So super technical, not that interesting, but really was a formative early career experience for me. Following that brief stint in the private sector, I transitioned to where I am now is working in high performing nonprofits focused on supporting those at the front line of change. So I spent several years at Social Finance US, which is an organization dedicated to helping uh, large, successful nonprofits grow and scale through public private partnership. And in that area, worked extensively also in workforce development, which I think is a close cousin of the higher ed system. And then, as you mentioned, most recently joined Mass Challenge. Mass Challenge is a global nonprofit. Our mission is to help entrepreneurs launch and grow businesses that can change the world. We like to think of ourselves as a global network for innovators. So we support hundreds of startups each year working across the sector, across the globe, including in the ed tech space. And there's certainly some incredible changes happening this year of all years, but also more broadly.
no, that's awesome. As you probably well know, I'm basically venturing and building my own ed tech for the first time. And we're so excited, given my background in education, we're so excited about that. So that's a wonderful story to hear. So, so the idea behind your career path and your journey, um, c- tell us how you think that informed the startup world and how the startup world can actually help and support higher ed in today's world environment.
Yes. So, I find myself startup facing most recently in my position at Mass Challenge, and it's a totally different space. It's vibrant. It's risk seekers. It's those who look at hard problems and are willing to tinker and take them on, and then take extraordinary personal risk to try and grow these ideas into meaningful ventures. And so, as I think about over the course of my career, it's been very much focused on how do you scale meaningful solutions against big problems, whether that's the issue of transforming student outcomes through data very early in my career to addressing driving better workforce outcomes by increasing access to high quality programs. And then now it's really about how do we bring to scale some of these incredible innovations that are out there, but have to get in to the system, if you would, in order to be able to test what they do, inform their solutions, and then ultimately scale them. Um, I'm really hopeful at the role that technology broadly, but also startups has to play in supporting the next phase for higher ed, whether it's artificial intelligence or virtual reality or even robotics. There are incredibly exciting applications that are underway that I think can make a big difference for the challenges that higher ed face, whether it's affordability or access or quality of outcomes.
Oh, great. That's awesome. So, in your current role, how do you see technology actually changing the landscape? I know you just mentioned a few things like AI and virtual reality, but how do you see it changing the landscape of education in general, but more importantly, higher ed, the space we're in?
Sure. So I think there are a couple of big buckets that are exciting that I've seen from my vantage point. One, which is really obvious, particularly in today's day and age, where doing this conversation virtually is distance learning. And I think what we see there is the opportunity to drive increased access for students, changing the economics of the higher ed landscape in a way that potentially allows you to scale much more quickly. And then ultimately, I think there's a very interesting question over time around effectiveness. Is it actually more effective for students to access bite-sized content partnered with, learning tools on their own time than attending a more traditional higher ed class or even educational experience? So that first one is, I think we'll see the capabilities of distance learning shaking up higher ed. The second is personalization. So certainly advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, even sort of big data more broadly, I think will bring to the forefront solutions that allow students to have a much more personalized experience, whether that's recommending course and career pathways for them, or even in how they receive, digest, and learn from content. Um, and I think part of that is also we're seeing in higher ed a shift from, IT investing in learning management systems. And I think of it as like Blackboard, right? Where you go and all your courses are listed. And so you know what you're taking, to really thinking about how do I invest in a system of solutions that create a much more robust learning experience ecosystem. And in there, you're seeing really interesting introductions of, say, virtual reality or soft skills training programs or collaboration tools across students that are bringing technology into the higher ed ecosystem in a much more comprehensive, inclusive way. And the last one I think I'll mention is uh, higher ed has an important relationship with the career marketplace, right? It ultimately is hopefully training you for a career or a professional role that has a positive ROI with your higher ed investment. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening also in the related landscape of HR tech, career pathways, et cetera, which I think will inform how higher ed thinks about preparing students for careers, whether that's the ability to disaggregate credits into skills that students can use on their resume rather than depending exclusively, for example, on that final credential or graduation credential itself. So I'll pause there. I think there's a lot more. There's so much opportunity in technology and higher ed.
Right. No, those are exciting points. I really, I'm fascinated with this concept around how education can actually inform and impact the workforce. So I'm very fascinated about that. That is something uniquely dear to me and something we're looking at.
Mm.
Do you see any major roadblocks and challenges that can for this adaptation of this technology?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say higher ed is not alone in facing roadblocks or challenges to
Exactly.
adopting
Right, that's true. Yeah.
technology. So we're not picking on higher ed at all. But I think there are some real challenges that they'll have to overcome. One is obviously has to fit into the budget, and I think that comes in a couple places. One is uh, historically solutions have been bought, say, from the IT department, but now we're talking about solutions that move from general IT infrastructure into all sorts of domains of a higher ed life, whether it's affordability, how students are sourced, the learning process itself. And so, like, where those investments come from, how budgets are allocated, I think is going to be important so that those who feel the pain points are able to make investments in solutions will be one important area to overcome. Um, the second is, culture and the digital fluency and comfort of faculty themselves, right? So, tenured faculty, for example, may have spent the majority of their careers teaching with a blackboard, and that is an art that they have mastered. And as we introduce additional tools into the classroom experience or into the teaching method, that requires change and adaptation and learning and integration of old ways and news. And I think we have to assume that it takes time and that there'll be a distribution along sort of willingness to adopt. And so we always encourage startups to think about really focusing on those who are likely to be early adopters, right? Whether you can sort of identify those faculty members because they're creatively using LinkedIn to build following for their courses, right? They're signaling that they're interested in sort of new ways of teaching, and so could be a good entry point. There are obviously a couple other challenges. One is another is facilities, right? So I think some of these types of investments will require new facilities, assets, internet capabilities, bandwidth, right? So it's going to require investment from some higher ed institutions to really be able to take advantage of the full potential of technology. And one of the reasons I think it can be hard, therefore, for startups to make inroads is because it can be hard to prove the efficacy, right? So when we're talking about such dramatic change in how work has been done, we're talking about meaningful investments towards capital expenditures or software purchases, et cetera. People are looking for proven return on investment. And I think generally across the education landscape, proving efficacy can be challenging, but particularly for a startup who's early on and needs higher ed to partner with them to improve the technologies and really demonstrate the proof point, we need institutions to take a risk and be willing to be part of that solution shaping.
Oh, that is great. And yeah, let's make sure we highlight the point that we're not picking on higher ed. We want to support. We are part of the looking at how we can support throughout the ecosystem. So that's our role, and that's what we would like to do in our small ways. So yeah.
Absolutely. At Mass Challenge, we partner with, we have a digital health program that works with health systems and a fintech program that works with large financial institutions. And I'll say the challenges are just as significant in both those sectors, where similar to education, the stakes are high. It's people's, in the case of education, their learning outcomes are on the line. In the case of healthcare, it's their healthcare outcomes are on the line. And so it's meaningful to take a risk on new technologies and see how it plays out.
Exactly. So what do you think needs to be done or can be done differently to make this technology able to be adapted across the ecosystem? We talk about faculty, we talk about the asset that's there and the stock that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see we go? What can be done? How can we collaborate and talk to them? How can they see us as a partner as opposed to necessarily, oh, they're the enemy? How can we change that mindset?
Yep. There are a couple of opportunities that we've seen and seen working. One is a huge number of amazing ideas come out of higher ed. And so the extent to which higher ed institutions can be really looking hard at the innovation they're fostering and finding ways to be that proof point for their students, it's a great allegiance between multiple goals, right? One is supporting your students in taking flight while also driving knowledge and practice of bringing technology in-house to, improve higher ed practices or improve cost effectiveness. So one is we strongly encourage higher ed institutions to think about not only how they tech transfer out of the institution, but how they use their own faculty, IT budgets, operations and resources to help startups test and grow their ventures. The second is, and this is related to work that we do in the healthcare system, for example, being explicit about the challenges you face that are unmet helps entrepreneurs innovate against those challenges, or helps entrepreneurs who are working on those challenges connect the dots between their solution and your needs. And I think that lowers the barrier, lowers the cost of experimentation when you feel as though the solution is directly addressing the the pain point that you have. And so I think that can help overcome some of the concerns about working with unproven or early stage solutions. There are additionally modifications that organizations can make to how they uh, procure solutions and technologies to make it more possible to work with or test early stage organizations to bring them in house. So that can be a very practical way to go at it. And the latter is, this faculty and students demanding sort of the next generation is what's going to really drive change. So the more that students can be advocating for differentiated experience or novel training tools, I think that can make a real difference in faculty and administrators looking to the outside worlds for different ways to do what they do.
Oh, thank you. I like that novel experience. That's it. That's exactly where it lies. Thank you so much for that. So we talk about this, the startup world. We are both involved in education and startup in some regards. Uh, what role, if any, can the startup actually play to move this along?
So startups are, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of incredible animals in that they're willing to take extraordinary risk with uncertain outcomes, right? So I think that's one, and that's pretty differentiated from a higher ed institution who has huge commitments to existing students, to alumni, to faculty, right? So these startups can take outsized risk. Um, they can also move fast because they're small and they're nimble, and they have to because they're rapidly working on experiments to figure out how they get to product market fit. And the last point about startups is they're incredibly persistent. They have to persevere against all odds. So I mentioned those first three things because I think as we direct the energy of the startup at the higher ed institution, it's going to be the David and Goliath. You're going to see startups slowly pushing higher ed to think differently, to adopt new technology, because they're not going to leave them alone. And they're going to knock on their students' door and say, hey, did you know that instead of uh, having to dissect a real frog, you could actually dissect one in a virtual reality, and then you can do it over and over and over and over again? The students and the faculty will say, wow, that sounds pretty interesting. And that actually may save cost over time, right? So they can put these solutions in front of individuals who will make a big difference for, and I think drive change within the organization. Uh, Startups are small though, so I think we have to think about them as making a difference en masse. And so we need a lot of startups doing a lot of work around driving change in higher ed to bring that tidal wave type effect.
Thank you. So that is unique. I like that, where they're innovating in a way that is benefiting the students and the faculties are and the students are asking for these necessary change. So I like that is awesome. I like that factor. Uh,
I can add
can
one other thought, which is we're in a time of extraordinary and profound change and challenge for the higher ed landscape. Uh, and I think we see innovation often coming at a point where there is tremendous challenge. So, certainly, we see in our startup community a huge amount of education focused activity. And it is hopefully at a time where higher ed institutions will be looking outside for solutions that reduce costs, improve student outcomes, facilitate distance learning. So, as difficult as this period of time is for higher ed institutions, their students, their communities, it may be just that push we need for higher ed to welcome more technology into how they work and serve students.
you mentioned distant learning, which is pretty top of the mind for most people right now in the education space,
Mm.
both students and faculty. From your vantage point, can and I won't put you on the spot, but l- l- list for us three main things that you think right now we can solve together, startup and higher education. what are the three things you would say, okay, here are three touch points that we can actually solve right now working together?
Specific to distance learning?
Um, just what you think the higher head probably could do, and distant learning could be one of them.
Yep. Um, it's a really interesting question. You know, one of the areas that I think startups and higher ed can partner is getting to a breakthrough point with access and efficacy. So startups and technology more broadly provide the architecture to scale access to education to a lot more students really quickly. Uh, and at the same time, I think technology also enables you to take those big classrooms and then create very personalized and customized breakout groups that map to a young faculty member who can do coaching on the side, right? Because you need educational outcomes to be there. You need not only the base level learning, but you often need the personal touch and coaching. And I think technology, startups and higher ed working together on that tension point around access and efficacy can make a lot of ground, and it's being forced right now. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see unique solutions coming out of this moment.
Oh, great, great. This is my final question to you. What are your takeaway from some of the experiences? What is the lessons learned, and how do we go forward?
Lessons learned. So I think there are a couple that I always harken back to. One of which I alluded to earlier, which is higher ed is a mission driven entity that has massive challenges. The more that they can share those challenges openly with the outside world, it will attract innovators to those problems. The innovators that we work with on a daily basis, they care deeply about solving big, important problems that make a difference in the world, often by bringing their own unique skills in science, technology, and engineering to bear on those problems. And so, uh, I encourage leaders of higher ed education to be a part of the innovation ecosystem so that uh, that community can understand what your needs are, what the challenges are, what the obstacles are, and begin to innovate to support you. Uh, the second is uh, small bets can go a long way to helping you make bigger decisions. And so, certainly for startups, we encourage them to work with a organization, higher ed in this case, on a pilot, and just get started so that you can learn and they can learn around what works. We have a really interesting alumni forager one who's working to build a more efficient marketplace between faculty, researchers, and interested student opportunities. And they started just within their own institution. And they've now been able to build a solution that's connecting the dots between the incredible talent that's across not only your own institution, but other institutions and the faculty needs. So just an example of where there was willingness by both the institution and the startup to just get started on creating a solution together.
Oh, that's great. And I know I said that was probably the last question, but this is definitely the final question, because it would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to ask you, given this massive digital divide, the haves and the have-nots, so to speak. We have lots of institutions that have all the resource and money to probably do some of these testing you're referring to. And then we go to other colleges and universities, such as the one that I teach at, City College and the CUNY system, that probably don't have the resource, and most of their students don't have the resources to do that. How can we? How I understand startup, and I know that they're always looking for the right target audience, the paying target audience, but where do we see some of the startup making the necessary step to test some of these ideas on the institution that might not be able to pay as well or as readily willing and able to pay, like the universities that we know that can actually do it? How do we kind of
Yeah.
make sure that this is an inclusive process and everyone benefits from this process?
It's a really important point, and it's a risk that we see across the entrepreneurial and technology landscape, which is that they're solving problems only for a certain portion of the population and not everyone at large. Um, we certainly think about training our entrepreneurs to think about the marketplace more broadly so that they're not just solving for one problem, but they're making sure they're looking inclusively at the challenges and what that means for how their solutions are shaped. We also think about how do we make sure that uh, all up and coming innovators realize that they can also take that risk to innovate and start a company that solves a problem that's relevant for them or their community. So, this would be ensuring that the same way that MIT has multiple entrepreneurial programs, that the college that you're working at has an entrepreneurship program that's encouraging students to look at the problems that are relevant and think about solutions that are in fact that can make a difference. Uh, I also think there has to be a funding solution to this, right? Which is that we need to make sure that there are resources that in the higher ed institution allow for equity across the landscape. I know in Massachusetts, where I work, there are state-led programs to support investment in technology infrastructure across the higher ed landscape, and I think those kinds of investments by the public sector are really important because we can't depend exclusively on those first two solutions alone, and we can't also allow for the digital divide to persist in perpetuity.
Thank you so much. This was quite informative and exciting. Basically, you have given us a lot to think about. I enjoyed so much, and I look forward to continuing our conversation and how we go forward. Thank you so much. Do you,
Likewise, thanks so much, Glenn.
thanks. Have a great day.